En definitiva, hay un Carlos antes y un Carlos después de la maestría. Los estudios del diseño es una manera literal de atacar problemáticas a partir del research. Cualquier proyecto visto a través de los estudios del diseño nos lleva a escenarios que posiblemente no nos imagináramos. Proyectos de escuela fueron los que me abrieron la puerta a un trabajo nuevo. Soy Carlos Moreno, estudié la maestría en estudios de diseño en CENTRO.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenas noches. Gracias por acompañarnos esta noche en esta conversación que tendremos enfocada en temas de diseño y género. Antes de eso, pues que quiero presentarme. Mi nombre es Jorge Camacho y soy el director de la maestría en estudios de diseño en CENTRO. Nuestra maestría es un programa pues único en el sentido en el que combinamos la investigación académica con la práctica profesional. Y en este posgrado lo que buscamos es básicamente pues dotar a nuestros estudiantes y egresados de las habilidades necesarias para entender, liderar y transformar la práctica del diseño. Y lo hacemos eso a través de, pues como había dicho en su momento, combinar la investigación en distintos sentidos, más hacia el lado académico, aplicada a la práctica del diseño y combinado siempre con una exploración sobre nuevos métodos avanzados de diseño. La idea, nuestra aspiración es pues dotar a nuestros estudiantes del conocimiento y las habilidades necesarias para que juntos podamos contribuir a una nueva etapa en la evolución del diseño. Además de pues obviamente nuestras actividades académicas regulares, generalmente organizamos este tipo de encuentros, presentaciones, charlas, conversaciones, algunas veces talleres, tanto en línea como en versión presencial, en la que continuamos con estas exploraciones, abrimos hacia una comunidad más amplia para poder como compartir pues nuestros intereses, los temas que nos atañen, los que estamos explorando, dependiendo del periodo en el que estemos en la maestría. Y hoy pues queremos compartir con ustedes nuestro interés por explorar la intersección compleja entre el diseño y temas de género. Y para eso tenemos una fabulosa invitada y en este momento voy a hacer la transición a cambiar al idioma inglés porque esta será una conversación en inglés. I was saying that in this occasion we want to share with you our interest for exploring the complex intersection between design and gender and the gender perspective, gender issues, etc. And for this, we have a really amazing guest. I want to welcome Dr. Sarah Elsie Baker. Sarah is the head of research and associate professor at the Media Design School in Auckland in New Zealand. And her research interests are focused on design and social justice, especially in relation to user experience, ethics, and critical design. She also has specific expertise in co-design, design ethnography, and multi-sensory methods. Sarah has been a really esteemed colleague for many years now. And more recently, she has also been really kind to become involved in our program. Last semester for one of our classes titled Contemporary Design Discourse, she came to or connected from New Zealand to teach a master class where she explores some of the issues that she will be sharing with us today. I wanted to invite her again now this year and now in this kind of like more of an open forum, because recently at the beginning of this year, she published her most recent book, Designing Gender, a Feminist Toolkit. So the idea for this session today is Sarah and I will have a little bit of a conversation where I'm going to ask her to basically situate her book in relation to her previous work, kind of like the context in which she's publishing this work. Then she will be presenting an overview of her book, some of the basic concepts and some of the main issues that she's tackling in this book. And then after that, we'll move to the conversation, more conversational part of this session. I have prepared a few questions for Sarah, but to be honest, I really wish that this becomes, to the extent that it is possible, kind of like an open conversation. And Sarah is coming with the same perspective. So throughout her presentation, we will be looking at your comments. Please feel free to write in the comments, to add your comments, and specifically to pose your questions. Because after Sarah's presentation, the idea is that we can also take some of your questions, and so that Sarah can respond, and so we can engage in this kind of like a more open conversation. So Sarah, thanks a lot for accepting the invitation. It's really a pleasure to have you here. How are you doing?
Oh, great. Thank you. Thanks, Jorge. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to see you again. We've known each other for a long time. And also to connect with the course and CENTRO in general. I'm sorry to everybody that I can't speak in Spanish. I'd really love to be able to do that. My Spanish is a bit rusty. So I think at least this time I better speak in English. Maybe next year.
Maybe another time. Maybe
Yeah.
next year, definitely. Because Sarah is being shy because actually her Spanish is really good. So as I said, before moving into Sarah's presentation, I wanted to give her the opportunity to situate her book in this larger context. So Sarah, I would like to ask you to talk a little bit about your background. So you studied for a PhD in cultural studies, and then you've published many articles. You have a previous book titled Retro Style, Class, Gender, and Design in the Home. So I want to ask you what sort of drew you to move further and deeper into design research, probably leading to this book.
So for me, before I did my PhD in cultural studies, I'd worked in design, and then I kind of veered away a little bit into cultural studies, but my work has always been focused on material culture. So I've been always really interested in things, I suppose, or objects, and how we use them and how we relate to them. And so that's always been a kind of thread throughout my work. And the book on retro style was really thinking about how value is created and how we value things. And so I'm from England originally, and I met Jorge in London when we were doing our PhDs together. And then I moved to New Zealand to teach design. So I've been here for almost 12 years, I think, teaching in design schools. And for me, it's been a kind of, this book has been like a really long time coming for me, partly because I was teaching around ideas of gender and design and social justice, particularly around gender. And what I found, and I'll talk really briefly about this in the presentation, is that there weren't many resources really, or many places for me to go to within design. Like there were lots of places within feminist theory or queer theory or cultural studies, but not so many kind of resources in terms of design. And so that's what's kind of led me down this path. It's also conversations with practitioners, so practicing designers as well, in terms of not really knowing where to start. Like the desire, I think, is really there, but I think among many designers there's a sense in which people don't really know how to how to broach the kind of conversation or the topic.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. Yeah, and of course we are here giving the space for Sarah to present her book. Hopefully the audience will eventually get hold of the book. We'll certainly have copies of the book in CENTRO's library. But just to give the audience an overview, Sarah's book is great. The structure is amazing. I really love it because, I mean, each chapter is kind of like a little book in itself, in the sense that that each chapter goes deep into different topics related to the overarching theme of designing gender. Within each of those chapters, reader can find key concepts like selected out and presented in a very clear in a very clear way. You also have interviews with practitioners. You have activities at the end, 1 or 2 activities at the end of each chapter, so that the reader, practitioner can engage in a very practical way with the ideas in the book. So the book as a whole is presented as a textbook, and it has all these comprehensive and explanatory attributes that one would expect from a textbook. However, when I was reading it, I realized that it goes beyond sort of like your typical textbook. And I would say that at least in 2 directions. On the one hand, considering these activities and all this practical content that I just mentioned, it is also really a great toolkit. You know, you can use all these activities, all these tools to really kind of like inject your practice with a gender perspective. But on the other hand, it also makes very novel contributions. Again, theoretical and practical, perhaps more than, or at least I would expect in a textbook. So one question that I was wondering when I was reading it is, who was the audience you had in mind when you wrote it? It's only been out for a couple of months, but what kind of public is already using and reading your
your book? I really like this question, because it was intentional that it's a kind of mashup of a textbook and a typical kind of what we'd consider like a theoretical text or whatever, and a toolkit, and that was intentional. So I'm really glad that you kind of read that through, you got that through reading. It's partly because I think that all textbooks, it's a kind of feminist approach, actually, because all textbooks come from a political perspective or a viewpoint. It's just whether that viewpoint's obvious to the reader or not. So, so for me, there was a kind of intent in making it personal, but also putting my kind of viewpoint and trying to further some of the discussions while also outlining them for people to make up their own mind. So I tried to kind of navigate making the key concepts clear and showing different perspectives, while at the same time kind of giving my own insight and view. So that's really, I'm really happy that that's the way that you understood it, which is great. In terms of the audience, I guess I was thinking of two audiences, and there's lots of crossover, I think, in most design schools now, in that lots of the students, so students is one audience, design students, but also design practitioners. And so, and in lots of cases, there's crossover between those two, right? Especially in postgrad. There's like most of the time, those people are the same. And I think that's where most of the interest is coming from. Although what has been fascinating for me is that in the school that I work, actually some people in marketing have read it, some people in academic kind of services. So kind of outside where I would have thought the kind of typical reader would be. So that's been interesting and kind of a really nice thing to hear, that it's interesting to people outside of design, because I wouldn't have necessarily kind of thought that would be the case. So that's really good.
That's really good. And it shows the sort of like the importance and the attention that perhaps the issue of gender is having more widely, like
I think
certainly
so.
design and beyond.
I think so, and I think at least, and then maybe this will come up, but I think at least in Aotearoa, so in New Zealand, among young people, there's been a kind of, there is changing in terms of how gender is thought about and approached. I think at least that's the sense I get. So I think there's a general interest as well as a specific one in terms of design and gender.
Yeah. So before we move into your presentation, where you will provide an overview of the book, and connecting with what you were just saying just now, one of the things that I mean, I see from my perspective is that the issue of gender, which really, I mean, along with basically any other thing today, can be very polarizing.
Yeah.
To give you the perspective from Mexico and perhaps Latin America more generally, I would say that we've witnessed some progress over the last few decades, both at the level of the discourse and also substantive changes, which are, of course, never enough. And I'm talking about in terms of gender equality, reproductive rights, LGBTQ plus rights, etc. However, we've also started to see something of a backlash. To give you an example, in these last couple of weeks, we've seen a couple of Latin American governments that have moved to ban inclusive language from public communications and procedures. Luckily, that hasn't happened here in Mexico, but it's happening in the region. So I wanted to ask you, how are things changing? What's sort of like the state in New Zealand? Is the issue of gender just as polarized as it is here in terms of political generations, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's obviously the way that gender kind of immerses itself or plays out in different, it is very cultural. So yeah, it's different around the world, and I've tried to include different perspectives in the book, so it's not just kind of based on case studies or interviews from, I don't know, Europe or even New Zealand. So I've tried to make it as diverse as I can, but I think that kind of polarization is at least from my perspective is happening across the world. I don't know across the world, but at least here it is. I think, and there is some backlash, particularly around, or you could say that has kind of been termed a kind of anti kind of wokeness. That there's a kind of there's a backlash against that. In fact, you could say that the idea of woke is kind of created to critique those kind of progressive ideas. So yeah, there is that here, and we just had a national, so it's essentially a conservative government elected, and partly they played into those kind of ideas. So yeah, there is a backlash. I think for me, one of the things that can play into that polarization is the idea of feminism only concerning women. And that really plays into that kind of polarization. Whereas if you think about feminism for everybody, and the idea that men are just, or they're differently affected, but they're still affected by the problems of the patriarchy. So an example would be how displays of emotion are seen public displays of emotion, or I don't know, talking about mental health, say men talking about mental health, those sorts of things. So that really negatively affects men's lives as much as women's lives. So I think I kind of would, the book has within it a kind of idea that feminist kind of politics is for everybody.
Yeah.
And also I'm not, I guess my kind of utopian dream would be a proliferation of gendered experience. Like, it's not saying that kind of hyper masculine kind of gender experience is wrong. It's just asking for a greater proliferation of different variations until ultimately it kind of doesn't mean very much. that would be like the place that I'd kind of go, in the sense that it's not saying that people's feelings about gender are wrong. It's just asking for a proliferation of gender experience, essentially.
Without perhaps a better distribution of power and privilege across that.
Related
spectrum.
to that. Yeah, and I talk a little bit about gender justice in my presentation, and the difference that I would see between gender equality and gender justice.
Well, I guess maybe this is a very good cue to move into your presentation, and then maybe we can go back to this last topic. Great. after you present.
Feel free to interrupt me or see how the time goes as well.
Yeah,
but
no
I think
worries.
I'll be okay. Okay, so just share my screen.
While you share your screen, I just want to remind the audience to use the chat to share your comments and questions, so that after your presentation, we can go into those.
Can you see my screen now, Jorge? Yeah. Okay, cool. So this is my book.
See it,
but
yeah, now I see it. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. So my book is called Designing Gender, a Feminist Toolkit, and I've talked about this a little bit, so I'll just be really brief. The reasons I wrote it was to really fill a gap that I observed when teaching and in conversations with practitioners. So I felt as though, studying cultural studies and teaching design for a long time, I had quite a lot of understanding of feminist and queer theory. And I also had some knowledge about different case studies and examples and work people were doing. But I felt as though there wasn't a place you could go to where you could encounter that work. Also, there was the link between feminist and queer theory and design practice wasn't there at that time. Now there have been a couple of other books that have emerged later last year and early this year that are really great, and I can share some of those if you want, as a kind of an accompaniment to my book. So I'm really happy that those are out and in contact with those authors too, because we each have a slightly different perspective. So I think other people noticed there was a gap as well. But at the time I was writing, I'd waited for a long time to someone to write this book that I had in my head, and no one did. So then I thought, okay, I better tackle it. And I really, I really hope it's a useful resource. That's kind of the main aim of the book, really, or from my perspective, for it to be useful. So it has a kind of practical impetus behind it. So in terms of the central arguments, and the main kind of point that I make, and that's why it's called Designing Gender in terms of a kind of active word of designing, is that I would argue that as designers, we are quite literally designing gender. So whether you're a product designer, a media designer, a UX practitioner, in lots of ways, by reproducing norms, or by using the similar methods, or even kind of quite often kind of unreflectively or unknowingly, we are designing gender. And so usually what's offered as a solution to gender inequality is, okay, we need more women employed in design, especially in leadership, because that's the area globally where there still is a deficit of women. Or, we need to champion design practices that women are involved in, or we need to include more women in user testing. So those three things are usually kind of in the media and in other academic texts, actually, they're usually offered as the solutions. And I would say, yeah, those things are important. Like, I'm not denying that they're important at all. They are, and I address them in the book as well. But for me, there's a major kind of challenge, and because I don't think that gender justice, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a bit, will be achieved without changing design values and processes and tools. And that's because most of the tools, for instance, and processes, that particularly the ones you might learn in design education, most of those have been established in the 20th century, probably 20th century, and they're kind of embedded within capitalism and patriarchy. And so for me, in order to change things, we need to use different methods or have different values and processes and tools. So even though, so I mainly now teach user experience design and design research more broadly. And the book takes a transdisciplinary approach. So I use examples from a range of different design disciplines. And that's really was also intentional in order to try and open up and challenge the gender hierarchies of design. So within modernism, and I'll talk a bit about this further in my presentation, within modernism, they kind of pre-modernism, it was established, there was a kind of hierarchy around decorative practices being more associated with women and the feminine, and more kind of technical industrial practices being more associated with modernity and men. And so by taking this kind of transdisciplinary approach, I'm purposely trying to open up and challenge some of those gender hierarchies. So as Jorge said, the book includes, and kind of each chapter includes these things that you can see on screen. So it includes theoretical discussion, case studies, key concepts, interviews, examples, activities, and questions for designers. And I suppose one of the other kind of arguments that I didn't refer to before is that the questions for designers I see as tools. So just as the activities are tools, for me, the questions are also tools. And I think often in design in particular, when we think of tools, we can go in our minds, we often either go to technologies, so things like new software and apps and everything, or we go to quite kind of prescriptive methods. So for instance, like the double diamond or the design thinking method, we think of that as a tool. And for me, I think the process of writing this book kind of made me think about what tools are. And for me, questions are a really good tool in kind of provoking us to reflect and think about things in different ways. So that's what is included in each chapter. I thought now I'll just talk about the first 3 chapters of the book. There's 6 chapters. And I'm not going to go into massive detail. I just thought I'd show you some examples. So you can kind of get a sense of what's included. So the first chapter does a lot of defining kind of work around gender, feminism, and things. And so for me, gender is a complex biosocial construct. And so I utilize a definition that recognizes the interplay of diverse biological, social, and environmental factors. and acknowledges the variety of experience of sex, gender, and sexuality. I think Jorge was talking about those kind of polarizing debates, and one of those within feminism, and it gets played out in the media, particularly around discussion about trans people or gender diverse people, is around that idea of nature nurture. So the binaries get kind of played out over and over. Well, which one is it? And feminism itself has been guilty of kind of thinking of gender as just a construct. And actually, you know, that's really problematic if you think about trans experience. So there's a sense in which this definition tries to highlight the complexity of gendered experience and what that means. Saying that, throughout the book, when I use the terms woman or man, I'm thinking about them as how people kind of self-identify, and also problematizing the norms around masculinity and femininity, and that those have been kind of culturally created over time and are very specific to different places in the world. So this, in the first chapter, I talk about norms and also the scripts that are built into objects themselves. And some of you might have seen these examples. They're quite well known. They're by Karen Elmberger, and this is the idea of kind of swapping the scripts on objects. So the drill dossier and the mega hurricane mixer, those kind of product design scripts that make a user feel like they use it in a certain way have been switched. I think it's an interesting practice in terms of highlighting, all of a sudden the drill doesn't really look like a drill anymore. It looks really weak and feeble, and then on the opposite side, that mixer looks, you know, really fierce and kind of more tough and masculine as well. So I think there's a sense in which these highlight some of those norms and the gendered norms. This the Andro chair was designed. So it's so they did some research with women around examinations, gynecological examinations. And one of the things that they found is that the design of the chair itself was one of the things that made those processes so difficult for women. And then what they also found is that when men have prostate examinations, it would be the kind of what do you call it, the from the medical kind of profession, the what they said was, but these chairs make it easier. So they then thought about, okay, well, this chair actually would make it easier for doctors to give prostate exams, but then it highlights how, you know, for me, it highlights how design isn't just about kind of functional utility, like it's also about feeling and experience. And when you flip it around, it raises all those questions around gendered experience and power. So then I've talked a little bit about gender justice and why the book is called Designing Gender. And the part, I guess for me, the difference is that gender equality is where everyone is given equal access. Gender equity is where everyone is given what they need to be equal. Whereas for me, gender justice is about redesigning, dismantling the structures of hegemonic masculinity, but then working then to think about, okay, how do we challenge them, and what do we do to do that? It also recognizes that gender justice or challenging inequality can't happen in isolation, and that it is an intersectional approach, that it also addresses racial justice or climate justice and queer justice. So that's kind of, even though for me this is a key concept, it does kind of, you can see that it shows a kind of personal perspective in terms of what design should be doing and how we should try to dismantle some of the existing structures. So in terms of norms, I have 2 little kids, and I start the book kind of talking about my kids. But this idea of the vicious cycle of gendered toys was really kind of helped me, or was interesting when thinking about gender norms in particular. So I don't know where we'll start on here. Pink and blue products get created, marketing gets more gendered, there develops a norm, there's social pressure to follow the norm, fewer people break the gender norms, and it reinforces the idea that girls and boys like different things, and so the cycle goes around. So the question then with scripts and thinking about trying to challenge this is, how might we design for gender without essentializing it, without working with fixed or naturalized notions of what women and men, or what the masculine or feminine is? And that's a kind of big challenge. And so one of the things that I think about at the end of that first chapter is how we might need different tools or different ways of thinking according to what problems. And so in the case of toys, we would do our own kind of analysis and situated kind of analysis of what we could do to kind of mess with this vicious cycle. And so I end that first chapter really thinking about or asking some questions around situated feminist tools. And so for designers, what do you see as the gender issues with existing products? How do they reproduce intersectional inequality? So you would need to do some analysis to kind of explore this and research. Why do you think the issues have occurred? And what would you like to see? And what counter strategies could you employ? So the counter strategies would be different according to where you were in the world and what relationship the users have with those objects. So, and this is a kind of really fast kind of go through of these chapters, but it gives you a sense of what's included. So at the end of each chapter, there are activities, and some you might have thought about a lot before, others you might not have. So in the first chapter, there's a gender journal that you could fill out to reflect on your gendered experience. And there's some norm discussion cards to consider with colleagues or classmates. One for me that I found really interesting, and I kind of new to, is that there's some recent research that suggests that to indicate professionalism, designers will often use masculine language when they describe their work. And that was kind of interesting for me, thinking about how even in kind of small ways, those kind of gendered hierarchies of good design and valuable design are played out. So chapter 2, Jorge, am I all good to go on to chapter 2? Yeah, okay. I'm thinking that the silence means yes. So chapter 2 is called Women, Craft and Technology. This image here, there's a case study in this second chapter. Hang on. Hi. Can everyone still hear me? Sorry, my computer's making strange noises.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, because you're on stage, so you couldn't hear me, but we're doing great. If you want to go to chapter 2, it's
cool. It's okay, perfect. I'm sorry. It's yeah, my computer is making some strange sounds, so I just wanted to check that. And can you? I'm just going to check that you guys can see my screen. Sorry about that, everybody.
I think it also gives people sort of like a moment to
a little break. Yeah,
a little break, and they can come with questions or comments.
Cool.
But yeah, people is connected, and people awesome. Are connected and engaged.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'm going to have to whiz through the slides. Here we are. Women, Craft and Technology. So the reason this chapter is in the book is because I argue that if we want to really understand and value the contribution of women over history in design, then we need to expand our understanding of what design is and what it involves. And so craft practices in particular have been a one way that women have been designing for well, since we've been humans. And I think there's a great quote from Judy Walkman that says that Indigenous women were the first technologists. I really love that. So I'm really lucky to know Diana Albaran Gonzalez, who I don't know if you guys are aware of her work, but she lives in Auckland in Aotearoa, but she comes from Chiapas. And so in her PhD, she worked with, I'm not going to pronounce it right, but she worked with Indigenous groups in Chiapas, co-designing with them and exploring their embroidery practices. And through that process of working, co-designing with the women, she then developed an idea around buen vivir centric design. And you can look up Diana's work, she's amazing. But I thought it really was important for me to have an example like this in the book that really opens up thinking around what constitutes design and offers alternative approaches. And Diana's work is really amazing at doing that, of thinking about how we might think outside typical kind of Western approaches to design and methodologies. So this chapter really is kind of identifying and expanding what we typically think as design practice. So this, some of you might be aware of these examples. They're examples that have examples of ideas and concepts that women have thought of and created, but maybe haven't kind of taken off or been known about. This is an idea that's actually it's by Frances Gabe. It's called the self-cleaning house. And Frances Gabe trained as an architect, but then she didn't practice. I don't think she practiced very much as an architect, but she was living with her husband and decided it would be good to have a self-cleaning home. So she designed a prototype, and this is a dish cupboard where you don't unpack and load the dishwasher. It just stays in there and washes, so you don't need to do any of that labor. She then built a self-cleaning house, a prototype of that, which there's a video online that you can find of her where she's kind of being ridiculed, really, because some of it doesn't work properly at that time. But for me, it was a really interesting example of thinking otherwise, or of kind of questioning why some of the things we are so used to are designed that way, and thinking of alternatives. And there are quite a lot of feminist examples historically of women kind of thinking of different ideas. So I included them in this chapter. There's also a section around feminist resistance and DIY practices. So I explore the role of fanzines in kind of creating community among women, and also a place for expressing ideas that might not find a place in the mainstream media. I mean, now we have the internet and all sorts of ways of communicating with each other. Some of the need for fanzines has kind of gone away a bit, I think. But what's interesting is, and I don't know about your perspective, but there seemed to be more a movement around kind of decolonial feminism that was coming. It is still coming out in fanzines, and they might be just distributed digitally, but actually the practice is still kind of quite vibrant in terms of Indigenous women and other kind of groups around the world thinking about feminism in different ways. So in some of this, and I kind of draw on all these kind of quite what I would call kind of feminist redesigns or hacks or ways in which kind of historically feminists have kind of created these kind of interesting ideas, and think about them as ways of kind of hacking gender. So then I ask these questions. Okay, can you identify technologies that are kind of ripe for a feminist redesign, and how might you go about adapting them? Like, could you make them laughable? So it wouldn't need to be a kind of redesign in terms of practicality, although it might be, but could you make it laughable? Could you make it glitch? Could they be reinvented outside of capitalism? And so then taking inspiration from those sort of histories of craft and DIY aesthetics, how might we enable alternatives that enable wider participation? So that's chapter 2. I'm going to go on to chapter 3. Yeah, and then we can open up for more questions. I'm a bit aware of the time. So the chapter 3 is women and designers profession. This is women. This is an image from Monotype, which is a big type foundry in the UK, and this is an image from 1940, I think. I will have to I have to get the credit, but what's interesting is there have been many women working in design, but their history until recently, the history of these women's practices has not been so obvious. It might be a bit earlier, actually, that image. So the argument I make in the 3rd chapter is that as the professionalization of a design intensifies, so too does closure. So in this process, women designers become less visible or shut out altogether. So if you think of the idea as everyone being involved in design practices, so when you make your dinner, you are designing a dinner, essentially. So what happens with professionalization is that some people have to say, well, I can design, even though everyone designs, I can do this better, I can be more professional. And with that comes closure. And what you get with design is kind of a utilization of industrial processes and scientific methods and approaches. So with that science, the kind of intensification of inequality or women being shut out of design kind of carries on or intensifies. So, and the professionalization of design and the closure of the field, particularly within modernism, was premised upon a disavowal of the feminine. So masculine aesthetics, and quotation marks around masculine, were seen, what was considered masculine, was seen as more valuable than what was seen as feminine. So, yeah. So one of the things that I think we can do to try and challenge that, and that's for design educators and practitioners, is to really get acquainted with our tacit knowledge. So as designers, there are practices we just do or feel, and we can really try to unpack that. I'm going to run through this pretty quickly. So, this is the last one. So I did some previous work in Aotearoa with a group of designers where we created this map around barriers to gender justice. And I think there were 5 areas that stood out. So ingrained binaries, judgments of value and self-worth, time pressures, division of labour, and lack of champions. And I think, I guess if we had more time, we'd spend more time with this map and you could kind of reflect on it, and it would be really nice to hear what your experience is in Mexico. So chapter 4 is making gender inequality visible. Chapter 5 is feminist design futures. And chapter 6 is sustainable practice and design beyond binaries. I'm going to end with this quote. This is the last slide. So for me, there seems our future as one in which disorder, breakdown, and redirection will become fundamental to the conditions of designing, and where place-based autonomous design becomes key to survival. Yet autonomy or self-direction do not mean the inevitability of gender justice. We must create tools that challenge and resist gender equality in design. at the same time enabling designers to adapt these tools to their own contexts and experiences. For me, a queer feminist ethic involves taking responsibility for the power relations we create through our designs and creating conditions of reciprocity and care. It means striving to think otherwise and the conscious and continual remaking of design values, processes and tools, and according to where and when we are in the world. So that's how I end the book. And I guess now it's kind of ready for its life after me. And I hope that other people use it in ways I didn't expect. So thank you. I'm just going to stop sharing.
Excellent. A great way to end the presentation and open for continuing the conversation. Thanks a lot for sharing, Sarah. I think I mentioned that at the beginning, that each chapter, I mean, Sarah only provided an overview of the first 3 chapters. Each of those 3 chapters goes way deeper. And then she shared, there's 3 more where she takes this issue of gender justice to this and expands it to these other areas. One of the things that I've been reflecting, reading your book and in your presentation now, and that is linked with something that you said before your presentation about how the issue of gender inequality, not only what you were saying is that the issue of gender inequality, the patriarchy, not only affects women and transgender people and all the people that are situated in a position of having less power in this system, but also affects men or people that self-identify as men and others that would seem to be privileged by the system. And something that I've been reflecting, and I think that you show very well in your book, is that gender inequality or gender injustice in design not only affects, again, women and transgender people and all the different people that are affected by this unfair system, but also, and this is what I'm trying to get at, also produces kind of specific design cultures. So we all lose by the fact that the system is organized in that.
If you, the one thing that in the chapter on women in professional practice or professional design practice, the thing that really was highlighted to me in my conversation with the designer in Korea was around time. So the masculinities at work, those kind of relational kind of ways that masculinities get played out, means that there's this kind of competitive pressure around deadlines and a kind of work culture that actually so like a feminist kind of intervention might be around like what does a slow approach to design practice, professional design practice look like, right? As a way of kind of queering that or challenging it. And that just affects everyone. So those kind of masculinities and the way that we are cultured into working and performing actually, affects everyone. The other really good example is pay. So there's an agency in London who realized, and it's really amazing, that their designers were getting paid differently. And on the whole, women, but also introverts, were getting paid less. Isn't that interesting? So then they designed an algorithm for transparent pay scales. So it's very clear, it's very transparent. They have an algorithm that looks at previous experience, all those different things, and then you get paid a certain pay scale. And so then it takes away all that part of asking, right? That horrible thing, oh God, I've got to ask for a pay rise. And which is so gendered, but also has all these other kind of cultural assumptions around it. the bolshy man is going to be paid more.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's super important to highlight. I'm hesitant to say. I hope I don't say anything bad, but it's not just about who wins and who loses, but it's about a whole culture that distributes power, privilege, success, mostly mapping into the divide between men and women, male and female, but affecting everyone.
Yeah, and I think and that's why I'm so interested in the idea of changing values. Because if we focus on changing values and practices and tools, then it's not about a kind of identity politics, which is the problem with the identity politics part, for me anyway, plays into that polarizing of arguments.
Yeah. It's not us versus them. It's the system. And changing the system can bring benefits.
And I guess, and I know that you will mean this too, Jorge, it's not the system as detached from individuals, but it's the system as thinking about the kind of holistic ways that we engage with that system, and then what we can do. So like I would encourage all people to think about their situated knowledge, so how their experience and their background and where they're from and everything informs their perspective. And then when they're working on a piece of design work, what blind spots do they have and what advantages does it give them? And everybody can do that. And I think just reflecting on that practice kind of opens up a space for, actually, I'm not the best person to think about this thing, right? I'm not, I haven't had experience in this area, so I need to go and talk to someone else. So yeah.
I want to take the opportunity to read some of the comments and questions that are coming from the chat. So Antares Velasquez, who is actually a former student of the program, she's actually developing a really interesting research very much related to these topics. She writes, amazing tools and concepts. I work around queer, diverse, and inclusive perspectives, and this toolkit with case studies, activities, and best practices are useful to understand how we bias our daily life while designing, she says. I would love to get the book, and Antares, I'll make sure that you get the book.
Yeah, I will. Jorge can just follow up with me and we'll work it out. Thank you.
We also have a message from Abril Teixier. She writes, we know the generations are key for social impact. Do you think this new generation, Gen Z, could be the difference regarding gender justice? What is your perception about the new generations? This is interesting.
I think my feeling here is similar, in the sense that I think attitudes around gender are really changing. And I think that's wonderful. I hope, and in a way, I guess this book is hopefully doing a bit of bridging work for us kind of older designers or older generations. I think maybe we have a slightly different perspective. And so, I'm really hopeful about that. I don't want to generalize, because generations are kind of a massive generalization. But I feel positive too.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Thinking in terms of generations is always a challenge, but there are certainly sort of like hopeful signs. I want to, while we wait to see if there's more questions, I wanted to follow up with some of my own questions. I think that also, taking into account the time, there's a topic that I think is very important, and it's one that we have been exploring very, directly in our program. which is the issue of women and the design profession.
Yeah.
Which you dedicate chapter 3 to. You open chapter 3 with really dramatic figures. You write that in the UK it has been estimated that the design industry is 78% male, despite nearly 2/3 of students studying design at universities identifying as female. Also, statistics from autora suggest that while almost 65% of design students in tertiary education are female, only 45% find work in the industry. And I wanted to complement those figures with ones that were used by one of our students, Lorena Macias, who recently published an article around this. And she found that according to the National Association of Universities and Higher Education Institutions, in 2022, approximately 66% of students enrolled and graduated from design faculties in Mexico were women. However, this presence is considerably reduced in positions of design leadership. And one of the ways in which this can be measured is in terms of earnings. So according to data from the Ministry of Economy, there is a significant wage gap among, for example, graphic designers, with male employees reporting an average salary which is around 25% higher from women. So of course, not just looking at those three countries, we can see that this gender inequality is of course widespread. So I wanted to ask you, can you highlight some of the ways in which this gender injustice shapes these design cultures? And I think we probably talked a little bit about this, or perhaps you can share some of the examples that you include in your book about.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's interesting. So since there was a really good study in the 80s that talked about the challenges around women in design and looked, and at that time in design education, it was written about industrial design. In that time in design education, there were hardly any women studying industrial design either, whereas now that's changed. So I think in design education, we've definitely seen a change. That's why those figures are different. But that map that I showed at the end, and I would have liked to spend more time on, as a really trying to understand the complexity of that problem. And in the sense that, so one of the people involved in that workshop had just graduated. And she said, I think for me, there's a major problem around confidence that I would see among like self-confidence that I'd see among my fellow students, in that designers who identified as male would make their portfolio and be like, oh yeah, that's good enough. I'm just going to go out and meet people and show it to them. Whereas she said among her kind of friends that identified as female, there was this kind of sense in which it had to be perfect, and kind of a less confidence in that. So that's just one example of how that plays out. And I think, so for us then in design education, it's that we can think about that, right? We can try and kind of, if we know about that issue in industry, then we can try and think about ways, or how can we kind of negate that. There's tons of other reasons, and I hope maybe it's something we could kind of post the map or something, and I'd love people to kind of comment on it, because it might be different in different places throughout the world. And I think that's part of the reason I hope to kind of produce that map. It's really a starting point in terms of people's thoughts and comments, because it is such a wicked problem in terms of how we create that change.
Absolutely. And I can perhaps use the map in some sessions in CENTRO and share back.
Yeah, that would be really amazing. Yeah.
One of the other things that we've talked about in classes is this it's almost like a funnel, or like a filter that is keeping women and people that don't identify as male from progressing into from education to profession and then to leadership, which I think, if I manage to frame this correctly, I think connects the themes you explore in chapter 2 and in chapter 3. So issues around the distinction between craft and technology, low tech versus high tech, and also the design profession, is that I think this happens like for everyone, but probably affects women more, is that in order to move, say within an organization, in order to move from being a practitioner, like what some organizations call like an individual contributor, to a manager, design leader, etc. Very often designers need to retrain and shift and design, so to speak, less, or at least be less in touch with the craft aspect of design and more into managing people and all that. I think that sort of also kind of like plays out with your exploration, right?
Yeah, I think so, and I think those gendered hierarchies of design practices still have a kind of legacy in terms of, you know, for instance, in New Zealand, I know that there are more illustrators who identify as female, and illustrators typically are paid less in design professions than other areas. So there's this, those hierarchies are still kind of, we still are feeling the legacy of that.
Absolutely.
Even though, you know, we can all think of exceptions, like there are amazing women in leadership in industrial design, for instance, but it means it's less likely.
Yeah, it's less likely. I want to take this opportunity to mention that I think CENTRO is one of those institutions that is perhaps you know, like outstanding or extraordinary to the extent that all our leadership is let's just say the diversity in our institution is much more balanced.
Great to
hear. Karen Santiago writes the following. She says, I think as women, we are aware of the challenges and the need for an inclusive gender perspective in design. The hardest challenge is always how to reach our male colleagues.
It was funny actually, because Jorge wrote some of his questions to me, and the last one was around the biggest challenge, and I think it's slightly different, but it's kind of similar in the sense. I wouldn't necessarily say male colleagues, but in my mind it was framed as clients. So for me, there's a challenge. Like as a design, I think most designers, when I've spoken to them, are really open to changing or being open to these kind of changes in their practice. What happens though is there's a kind of commercial imperative that comes through the client, which is around working with what people expect and what the norms are and how people relate, and there's a safety and profit involved in reproducing those norms. So for me, yes, I think male colleagues, but I think there's ways. I think there's ways of doing that. The client issue is a more challenging one in my mind. But
that's really interesting, because it makes me think about this intersectional perspective. So it's not just male colleagues, but it's clients, and clients means basically businesses and dare I say the word capitalism.
So that's and I think that's
through the patriarchy.
That's challenging, because lots of these tools and ways of viewing the world and values actually also or to some extent challenge capitalism. So
so much to continue talking about here. Just want to maybe read one more comment and give you the time to close. Conciencitas in so Little Consciousness in YouTube writes, there is no conciliation in the caregiving. All goes to women. That's why there is much less women in design practice.
I think and you're right. And I think, you know, throughout the world, so in some places it's changed. It actually hasn't changed very much when you look at the figures in terms of primary responsibilities for caregiving. So I definitely think that's a factor. And the challenge is that all these things are very interconnected. So then we can think about, okay, where in all those kind of barriers and those challenges, maybe we can, in a kind of transition design sense, actually, maybe we can intervene in a few of them. Maybe you can do a small thing in Mexico and I can do a small thing in Aotearoa. And we can try things out and see if we can intervene, because we're not going to solve it overnight, but maybe we can create some small interventions.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a perfect way to start wrapping up, because I want to be mindful of your time. I know that your kids are probably arriving from school.
Yeah, they're playing outside the window, actually, I think now.
But I think that's a great invitation. And I was thinking that, I mean, your book has only recently been published. And I hope this was an opportunity for you to share your ideas, to give a quick overview with the community in CENTRO and in Mexico in general. It's probably kind of like the start of a long process. You will be sort of like doing workshops and teaching and giving more talks. So hopefully, if you're up for it, maybe in about a year or so, we should organize another event. And maybe where you can report back on your experience, like sharing your ideas with the design profession, and maybe we'll also start doing some experiments here in CENTRO so that we can report back to you
that would be
the experience
really great
with our tools.
If you have any students who are interested in design and gender as well, I'm more than happy to, they email me. I'm really happy to chat with them.
We have a lot. So Antares, we have Lorena, we have Marisabel. We have a lot of students doing really interesting work. Cool. I mean, some of them you've already met, and you know they know your work. But I hope that our program can be one more platform to discuss these issues and to do work around it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jorge.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Great.
Thanks again for accepting the invitation, and thanks a lot to the audience for connecting, their comments, their questions. Keep how do you say it? Like stay tuned for more debates around design and gender.
Awesome. Thanks.
And I think we have sorry.
I was just going to say goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you. I think we have, we'll share just like one slide with where you can get more information about our program, and through that about activities such as this one. So yeah, you can see, you can scan that QR code to get more information about our Masters in Design Studies, our Maestría en Estudios de Diseño, and get more information with Beatriz Pretel. Thank you so much. See you next time.
En definitiva, hay un Carlos antes y un Carlos después de la maestría. Los estudios del diseño es una manera literal de atacar problemáticas a partir del research. Cualquier proyecto visto a través de los estudios del diseño nos lleva a escenarios que posiblemente no nos imagináramos. Proyectos de escuela fueron los que me abrieron la puerta a un trabajo nuevo. Soy Carlos Moreno, estudié la maestría en estudios de diseño en CENTRO.